Good morning and welcome to the David and David on Real Estate podcast. Today we are on episode number 146 and we have Lena back from New Venture Property Management. Lena, we're so excited to continue the conversation. We got into talking about difficult tenants and how to be a good landlord and what that kind of entails. But let's continue the conversation. We want to hear some great stories about, what have you experienced with tenants and, how did you make it a good outcome at the end of the day?
Oh, geez. I don't want to scare your viewers. I have some of the best stories that you just couldn't make up. Um, but I will, so I'll share one of the very first property I ever purchased with my husband, was a triplex, super distressed, in a town that's about 4 hours from where we lived at the time. So we always close on a Wednesday. And that Saturday after closing, we decided that we were going to go and visit our property and see our tenants and make sure everything's okay. And halfway down the 401, I got a call that says the basement apartment's flooded and you've got, an hour to respond. Otherwise, I'm calling the city and blah, 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 all kinds of things. So we're brand new investors. We have no idea what's going on and we're rushing there to see what happens. So it turns out our tenant had pretty much jimmied out the bottom of the hot water tanks and flooded her own unit because she was under the impression that we would be housing her in a hotel until we fixed her unit. Now, to put things into perspective, her unit was, in my opinion, it should have been condemned. It was so bad in terms of the conditions before the water. So to begin with, like that unit needed to be completely gutted and redone once they had vacated. We already knew this. And second, she wasn't paying rent. We were not aware of this because we were new and we took the word of the owners and we took the word of their representative when they gave us their documents. We didn't know how to kind of verify those things. So she had not been paying rent. So she'd been living for free. The place was a dump. She flooded the unit and she thought, now we're going to go and put her up in a hotel. She's going to live the high life and she's going to come home to a brand new unit. Her problem was she had a 21-year-old girl from Toronto with a serious attitude problem who was like, hold on a minute, this is not allowed. So we had a whole altercation. They moved in the middle of the night. They changed the locks. They stole our appliances. So I'm telling you the story because I was able to get all of my stuff back by noon the following morning because when we were working on our due diligence, I had gone to the property to meet all of my tenants and I had them fill out a "Who am I?" questionnaire. Tell me about you, your birthday, your pets' birthdays, your kids' birthdays, all of these things, because we send out presents and we do this and we do that. And then who are your emergency contacts if ever there's a problem? So when I called the police to report that they had damaged my property, and again, I didn't realize that, police generally don't help with these things, but I was very fortunate when I called for the stolen appliances. I gave them my form and sure, who did my tenant go to in the middle of the night? To their emergency contact. The police officer was flabbergasted. He had no idea. He said to me, he goes, how did you get this information? And I looked at him and I was like, I asked. And that afternoon, the gentleman who was living in the unit, the man of the house, came back with a pickup truck with all of my appliances. And I stood in the middle of the street and I embarrassed him so much. I shamed him. And I earned this title of this crazy, bee from Toronto in that small town. So then when I would start to get rental inquiries, people would ask me if I was the person who was renting to so-and-so, and I would say yes, and people would hang up. So that was my first kind of tenant experience. And it led me to understand that number one, like documentation is so important. Like you need to ask for everything that you can under the sun. You may not get it. It can't necessarily be mandatory. But if you ask with I genuinely was asking because we do send birthday cards and we do send all of these things. And I do want to know who's in those units in case of an emergency. Like I genuinely was asking for really good intentioned reasons. But if I didn't have that information, they would have totally won and I would have been disheartened and I would have been angry. And instead I had a confidence boost and I had a very small town who now knew that this crazy girl, I don't know if you want to go there because she's a little weird, She doesn't function like the other landlords, so maybe we'll take our bad behavior elsewhere. And because of that, for 20 years, we still have that triplex. My God, I love that thing. It's a cash cow. It hurt us really, really bad, but we don't have problems. We don't have problems in that city. And I had that woman, that same tenant, actually apply for one of my other units, and I laughed. I was like, "You don't know who I am, do you?" But that was one of our first kind of experience. And I have others, but we'll be here all day if we keep going.
Well, one thing that I picked up on that is, you're closing your transaction and there was probably not a requirement in your agreement of purchase and sale for the tenant to provide an estoppel certificate, right? Which you probably learned, through the process, that anytime you are buying an investment unit, you don't want to just take the landlord's word for it as to what the rents are, whether the lease is in good standing, whether everything, there's no damages, everything is fine. You want to get that all from the landlord. You want to get it in a form of statutory declarations, that their swearing is true, but you also want to get something directly from each of the tenants in the property confirming what their lease is, there's any amendments, any promises the landlord made, if there's any damages or any defaults by the landlord, or they acknowledge any defaults of theirs, how much deposit, have they got interest in the deposit? You want all that directly from the tenant. Okay, and that's usually called a tenant estoppel certificate or something to that form, right?
Oh, absolutely. My goodness. The list of requirements now that go out with an offer for us, like the checklist of what they need to send back, is insane, again, because of all of these experiences. And we were working with people that didn't have a clue, and we were working with people, we were under the impression that if I go to the seller's agent and they represent both sides, we'll get a better deal because they're not sharing their, commissions. Not very smart. That seller may not necessarily have an agent who's going to be willing to represent both parties equally, right? So we learned, yeah. Oh, that declaration right there is absolutely a non-negotiable for us. And it goes sometimes, again, depending on the type of property. I think it's very important for landlords to understand that depending on the type of property you have, you're going to be dealing with a very unique or different type of individual. And, who I might be putting into a luxury penthouse in downtown Toronto versus a basement apartment in, let's say, Cornwall, are going to be two very different things. And my requirements will be different, but it doesn't mean that these people are any better or less than one another. It's understanding what it is. Like, I can't go through and expect the same kind of requirements from that person in the basement apartment that I would from the guy wanting to rent my penthouse. And as such, if I'm buying a property that has, let's say, somebody in a penthouse, I'm going to ask very different questions to verify than I would a multifamily property that's got tenants who, may potentially have different challenges. And, working with people who understand that helps a lot. Like, if you have an agent who is able to tell you that, who is able to say, "Hey, Lena, like, you know what? Let's make sure we have all of this information." That person is worth their weight in gold and then some.
Yeah, and I want to get back to what you told us a little bit in the first podcast we did with you. You mentioned that you've got your 13 pages of schedules attached to your lease, and how you try and protect yourself as a landlord, right? And then you can have your tenant initial every single page and sign at the end of it. And then you have a problem with that tenant and you go to the tribunal and you hold that up and you go, "See, judge, look, he signed, he knew there was, it was there." And the judge will still say, "Well, what evidence do you have that he actually read that and understood?" He said, "But he initialed it." "Yeah, but he may have initialed, but they don't, English isn't their first language, or maybe it wasn't explained to them." "Well, did they have a lawyer review it with them at the time? What evidence do you have that the lawyer went through page by page and explained it?" Like, they'll bend over backwards, even when you've got all the documentation in your favor, which I encourage everybody to do. But it's so difficult to deal with that tribunal, right? So I want you to talk about that. And then even if you can satisfy everything under the Residential Tenancy Act, they'll say, "But aha, there's a human rights issue here."
David, you're
Oh,
speaking
David,
Lena's
that is
language
the
now.
big one everybody forgets, is the human rights. So let's talk about the schedules. And then I really do want to talk about the human rights aspect, because I feel that especially real estate agents who don't understand the human rights put themselves in harm's way. Like, they paint giant bullseyes on their back. And I want to give them a few tips to ensure that they're not going to do that. But let's talk about the landlord and tenant board. So I think one of the reasons why we have been able to be successful in the very few instances that we have had to go to tribunal, and I say that a little bit with a, low key, gloat, because being able to resolve a problem before you get to the LTB is a skill set that very few possess. And I think one of the reasons why I have been able to accomplish that is because I spend a lot of time reading Canley orders. So we have a website, canley.org, where every single order that has been issued by the landlord and tenant board, and any real tribunals or anything, but let's, for our purposes here, the landlord and tenant board is published. And I know that it sounds horrible. And again, you don't have to do this. You just have to find people who enjoy doing it. I read it because those adjudicators, they're not judges. This isn't a court of law. It's an adjudicator at a tribunal. So they are able to use their judgment to decide how they want to rule. So if I read an order and I see how an adjudicator is, deciding, I know what type of precedent has now been set that a tenant's representative might bring up at a future hearing in order to kind of get their way. So my job now is, during that entire process, when the tenant is now starting to create problems, because, okay, so let's just use an example of my tenant isn't picking up after their dog in the yard. Okay, this is something that is so common and it's so gross. And especially in a multifamily property, it causes so many issues. So we have an addendum that says when you have pets, right? Because we don't say you're not allowed to have pets, because even if we do, when they bring them in later, there's nothing I can do about it. So what I need to do is make sure you understand what you are required to do if you have a pet. So we talk about, you've got to pick up after them. They can't be let loose in common areas, if there's damages, things like that. But let's say I get a complaint about feces that aren't being picked up. The first thing that we do, obviously, before we issue an N5 form, which is the proper tribunal form that you would, file in order to start this process, we send a picture, we send an email, and we say, hi, I'm not sure if you're aware, but it was brought to our attention that this is the current situation. And I just wanted to remind you, and I go through that entire thing with them. And I generally get an email back. The first email back I get is one of two. One is, oh, I am so sorry. I sent my kids out with the dog. I'll go pick that up right away. And the second is, that's not my dog. The neighbors are probably bringing their dogs into our backyard. Not my problem, not my problem. Okay, I understand. So just so we're clear, you understand that your dog needs to be picked up after. This is not your dog because you're always picking up after. Of course, I know. That's usually the response I get. Now I have evidence that my tenant understands the rules. Okay, so this is what you need. It's a very long kind of process, let's say, but I already know that as a landlord, what is the probability that I can prove, unless somebody is taking photos of said dog pooping and videos of said dog pooping, how can I actually prove that it's your dog, right? If there's the only person who has an animal in the building and your yard is fenced in and the likelihood of somebody coming out, it's a little easier. But if it's in the front yard, it's not going to be hard. So all we want to do is get confirmation that they understand the rules. Then the person who's filing the complaint, we let them know, look, this is the situation. We have somebody who's going to come and clean up the yard. I need you, if you see this to happen again, to take photos and or video, because they're saying it's the neighbor. And if it's the neighbor, I need to be able to go and let that neighbor know, because this is not acceptable for any of you to live. So now you've got your own little kind of investigator who's going to collect that evidence that you need for you. And you let them know. You don't go in there and say, oh my goodness, that guy upstairs is so horrible and he's this and he's that and he's denying it. What you say is, look, I need to know, because it might be the neighbor. I talked to them. They said it wasn't their dog. They said it's the neighbors and they do this on a regular basis. I need evidence. Can you just keep an eye out? Or if you have a Ring doorbell or something, just if you've got footage, send it to me. Now that you have that, you can file what's an N5. And then this starts the process. So if you know that when you serve an N5, the tenant has 6 months, and then if they fix the behavior, everything's forgiven. Then if it starts again within 6 months, we issue a second and I get to tribunal. You know, in that 6-month period, your job is only to send an email, get acknowledgement that they understand it's not okay, and collect evidence that shows that they're still doing it. That's time-stamped. So we had an email on October 1st that said, I know I have to pick up after my dog. And on October 4th, I have a video from the Ring doorbell showing the dog using the lawn as its washroom and my tenant walking away. So now, Mr. or Mrs. Adjudicator, what is there to debate? So this is how everything that you do needs to be done is, yes, you've signed and acknowledged that addendum. And everybody gets a first free pass, short of you set the building on fire, you know, harmed another human being on the property. At that point, there's no leeway at all, but the first go is free. You know what I mean? You smoked inside, we signed a no smoking clause, you didn't understand it. Okay, great. Let's get that acknowledgement in writing. I just explained it. Do you understand? In writing, yes, I do. Okay, well, we just had this discussion. Here's your form because you're still doing it. And this is how you're going to go through. And the other thing to understand is we have a housing crisis. So the landlord and tenant board and the government, obviously, their goal is to keep as many people housed as possible. A lot of people get upset by this, especially landlords, because they feel that, you know, what the heck, you didn't pay my rent, get out. But what they don't realize is the bank follows very similar rules if you miss a mortgage payment. They can't just show up the next day and lock you out of your house. There is a process. There's time that they have to give you for you to be able to catch up on your payments. The landlord and tenant board does the same thing. Our problem right now is the backlog, which is causing delays that are making this a very big problem. So if we know that the goal of the tenant board is to keep people housed, then what we know is we have done everything. I have to be able to show that I have done everything I can in my power to keep this individual housed while still respecting the laws, respecting their neighbors, and doing all of the things that they're required to do by law. And if I spend the time I'm waiting for a hearing, collecting all of the evidence and showing my attempts to keep this person housed while correcting the behavior, you're going to have a much easier time at tribunal. I think a lot of people think that I'm in the right, you're in the wrong, you're a terrible human and get out. And their only focus during that period of waiting is to get them out. So it becomes a very kind of aggressive, bullyish type of interaction for, you know, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. And then you get to tribunal and the adjudicator sits there and goes, well, other than bullying the guy for the last 6 months, what the hell have you done to like help solve the problem? Versus, here you go, sir. Like, I have tried for 6 months and it's not going anywhere. There's nothing else that I can do. It needs to either be ordered to stop and stopped, or they need to leave. And when you get an order from the tribunal, I don't know if everybody understands this either, you can request that this order is written in a way that says, this is what has to happen, A, B, C, and D. If those things don't happen, the landlord can file for an ex parte order, which is an order to evict without a hearing. And then the tenant is evicted and you can call the sheriff and have them removed. So if you have that clause in the order because you've requested it, now you don't have to start that process all over again. The tenant either has to follow what's said or their sheriff is going to remove them. And now you're saving yourself time, and it's just a matter of understanding that.
And then maybe just touch on how the tenants will then drag in the human rights issues.
Oh, okay.
Because my understanding of the law, and I don't do landlord and tenant stuff. My understanding of the law is even pooping dogs have human rights somehow.
So yes and no. Yes and no. So I can't deny my tenant the right to have an emotional support animal or a companion or any of those things, right? So if my tenant can, okay, so let's talk about human rights first of all.
Your favorite topic, by the way, Lena.
Pardon?
Your favorite topic.
I know, because it's so like, Crazy. So number one, and remember in the previous episode, I had talked about how I have like professional athletes who have to talk about not creating brothels in their homes. And it's because everybody has to be treated the same. This is number one, is you need to make sure that every single one of your tenants, no matter who they are, is treated exactly the same way when it comes to documentation. Because the first thing your tenant will come after is a human rights situation, which is they are targeting me because of my ethnicity, because of my, religious beliefs, because of my socioeconomic status, or whatever else it will be. So one of the easiest ways for a tenant to prove that is if, let's say, you have a professional athlete in one of your units and their rent is late and you don't issue an N4, and then you have an individual who is maybe collecting some sort of a pension or disability support or something, and they're late, and the very next day you issue them an N4. They will come back and say, you are targeting me because I am a person with a disability and from a human rights perspective, because the rich guy didn't get a notice because you thought, oh, the rent is coming, and the not so rich guy did, you have now violated the human rights code. So same kind of deal.
Lena, in that situation, like if you think about it, they're absolutely right.
But your intention may not have been that. You know what I
Right.
mean? So it could
Right.
have been a situation where that person had let you know in advance, and this person is doing it all the time, and they're really crappy people. Human rights doesn't really care about that. Human rights is like, this is how you made them feel. We're dealing a little bit more with feelings. And from a human rights perspective, it's
Discrimination.
very much so, right? And it's not even that you had to intend, like, you have to have made them feel like they were discriminated against. They feel like they were somehow less valuable than another human being. And I think one of the biggest things that many real estate agents don't realize is when you are advertising for a rental, when you put verbiage in your ads like ideal for families because you're close to a good public school or things like that, great for students because you're close to a university. If you put things like perfect office for those who work from home, this verbiage is actually discriminatory. Because somebody who read your ad, they never applied for your unit, they never communicated with you, can go to the Human Rights Tribunal and say, I felt discriminated against because I don't have children, and they said that this is a place for families. Now let's take another layer onto that and say, now as investors, we want to make sure that our tenants are able to comfortably afford the homes that they live in. We don't want them stretching themselves thin. We don't want them to sacrifice food just to pay rent. So we want to make sure that they have an ability to pay. If we go back and say, I need proof of employment, that's discriminatory. If I say, and this could be just in your comments. This is the other thing. It's not publicly there, but it's in the comments, and maybe that tenant's representative shares this information. If you say AAA tenants only, 30% rent to income, it is not allowed. And it's because shelter is a human right. Ownership of shelter is not. So when a bank requires 30% income to mortgage ratio, because ownership is not a basic human right, they are not discriminating. If you make this same request, you are discriminating because you're providing shelter, which is a basic human right, and now you're making it dependent on a person's ability to pay based on your standard versus theirs. Human rights says, a dollar in for every dollar out shows their ability to pay. It's not your business how they deal with the rest of their life. So we need to be very careful about those things. We need to be very careful about why we choose to go with one applicant versus another and what information we want to share about that. My advice is never share why you chose somebody else, and definitely don't base it on things like, oh, you're self-employed versus traditionally employed. Totally not allowed. Now, I am allowed to ask for a notice of assessment to show your ability to pay, because my notices of assessment will actually capture any kind of income that I have, whether it's a disability pension, whether it's self-employment income, traditional income, doesn't matter, right? The CRA does not discriminate against who they take taxes from. So when I ask for a notice of assessment, I'm factoring in all of your income regardless of source, and then I can use that information to make a decision. I can ask for employment income as long as I clearly state that any form of income. So for me, we do a lot of advertising on Facebook for our listings. So I know that there are trolls out there who are just looking to make a case. Since COVID, this has been the new way of people earning a living, is let me just go and put in ridiculous claims through the Human Rights Tribunal. My feelings were hurt. Even if I collect $5,000, I'm set for the next 2 or 3 months. And you know, because they'll ask you very specific things like, what are your application requirements? Oh, it's pretty standard. And they'll come back and say, what's standard? Proof of ability to pay. Oh, you mean employment? My response is no. Proof of ability to pay, what that means. And I give them a list. If you collect OSAP, if you collect ODSP, if you have CPP, if you have child support, if you have alimony, if you have parents overseas who send you money, I just need proof that there is money coming in that can then be paid out, and cash doesn't count because I can't see it and verify it. That's what I say. And that's what you guys want to be able to use in terms of verbiage, just to protect yourself. Same deal when they say, you know, families are only 2 occupants, and does the city bylaw or zoning say that you're only allowed 2 occupants? Or is this now something that you've decided and you've discriminated against like a whole series of people, and, you know, here you go. So it's very important to understand that we have landlord and tenant rules, right? They govern how we set our leases and what's required. And then we've got human rights that are also very important. But then we also have like city legislation that you need to think about. So as a real estate agent, if you represent, let's say, landlord or investors, sorry, that's the word, who are looking to develop parcels of land, maybe make sure that you understand landlord and tenant board rules, yes, but then like the city of Toronto, if you tear down a rental unit, you have to replace that rental unit, right? It's a bylaw. The landlord and tenant board doesn't say you have to do that. The city of Toronto does. The city of Hamilton has new bylaws on how you're allowed to remove a tenant for major repairs or demolition. And if you, as an agent, don't understand those bylaws, you could end up getting your clients into some difficult situations because their numbers were based on a certain thing, because landlord and tenant board says, I need to submit this form and this is how much compensation I have to pay and this is the situation. And the city of Toronto comes back and says, no, you got to do all those things, but then you have to give them back their home at pretty much the same rate they were paying. And the city of Hamilton comes, I kid you not. And then the city of Hamilton comes back and says, you've got to pay them the compensation, but you also have to pay for wherever they're going to live until you're done, and then they can come back. So these are very important things, but the human rights, oh God, like we should do a whole day just on that. Please, like whatever you do, make sure you treat every single human being, regardless of who they are and what they're like. And I mean, treat them however you want to be. I can be mean sometimes, and I am equally mean to everybody, like non-discriminatory. If you did this, you're getting that reaction. And that is like, it doesn't matter who you are, 100%. So just make sure you're consistent with every single person, and make sure when there's complaints in between units. So I had tenants who, they were living in a basement apartment, and the people above them who had just moved in had 2 young children. The kids, you know, they're loud, they run, they're home, and this tenant was constantly complaining. My job now became educating these young people who don't have children why these children, I understand they're a little bit annoying, but there's nothing that they're doing that is wrong for me to go in and take any action. The only thing that I can do is let your neighbor know that this is the situation, but I encourage you to please have a neighborly discussion with them, right? Because sometimes what would end up happening is maybe we have a really good relationship with that tenant in the basement. They've been there a really long time. They've been wonderful. We want to keep them. And this new person, we don't really know them yet. And now my person who's never complained before is complaining. We assume that they must be right. And I go and I call that mom and I'm like, hey, I don't know what you're doing. I'm being told you're screaming and yelling at your kids and they're doing this and they're doing that. You can't do that. Da, 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 da. I'm now discriminating her because her children are being kids. You know what I mean? She didn't break any laws. They're not violating any bylaws for noise and things like that. And it's important for you to understand those things. And I tell that to people all the time. I tell that to my tenants all the time. Okay, I understand it's noisy, but what time is this happening? And the first thing I need you to do is I need you to call bylaw, and bylaw needs to confirm that they're violating the noise requirements, because it's their noise requirements that we're following. There's no real noise requirements from the landlord and tenant board. That's all open to interpretation. But if bylaw comes back and says, yes, they've exceeded the dBs allowed based on the city's bylaws, now I have tangible, concrete, non-discriminatory proof. Oh, yeah. Human rights, my goodness.
And I feel like we could be here for 10 hours talking about this, but so important. And, you know,
Very.
when you put yourself into the tenant shoes and look at it from a tenant perspective, everything that you talked about and you mentioned makes complete and utter sense. You know, like, this is their home. This is where this is their safe space. And you know, it's interesting because I'm a big advocate for landlord rules, and you know, I want to shift that balance of power. But you know, there's also bad landlords out there that bully, that you know, mistreat people, and it only takes one situation where that balance of power is so infringed that you know, you put such undue pressure on the tenant that it creates a situation that there's no coming back from. And
Yeah.
we had an employee here at the brokerage a couple of years ago. They were newer to the country, and the landlord decided to turn off their AC in the middle of the summertime, completely unplugged it from the panel because they had too many people in the residence, and they didn't like that many cars in the driveway. You know, and I remember, you know, we called the tenant as an office, as a brokerage. I wrote them a letter saying, hey, this is against residential tenancy rules. And they told me to go to screw off. So then we made an application, we helped the tenant through it. But like, before anything could be done about the situation, summer passed. And they were forced to live for a number of weeks in like unbearable temperatures, and ultimately they made the decision to move out of that place by themselves on their own accord. And I was like, wow, you know, look at it from another perspective. Like, I'm an investor, you know, I want to shift the balance of power to the landlords. But when you look at how much power landlords have to, you know, turn off hydro, turn off ACs, turn off running water, you know, change door locks and stuff like that, like, these are situations that there's no coming back from if they happen, right? So,
I agree.
You know, as an investor and as somebody that has a big personal interest in what you're talking about, so many lessons out there to, you know, really standardize your practice and treat everybody the same. And that human component is so vital in these situations. And I think more landlords need to really understand the impact of human rights on their relationships. And I think if you do, I think it's going to make you a better landlord, a better property manager, and it's going to really improve a lot of situations. Like, you know, you're right. If you have a negative situation and you apply to the landlord and tenant board, you know, what have you really done in the last 6 months to really fix the problem? Right. And not just bully, not just get mad, not just like put your foot down, and not just like be pissed off at the rules, but what have you really done to fix the issue?
Oh, I agree. I agree so much. And every rule that has come into place is there because somebody tried to take advantage of the law. You know, when the previous provincial government removed the exemptions for rent controls, they did so because people were using that no cap rent increases as a means of pushing people out of their homes. Right? I'm going to send you $1,000 increase because I can. The city of Hamilton, you know, changed their bylaws because landlord decide to buy a complex of relatively affordable townhomes and evict people one by one to renovate and just re-rent at increased price points. So the city decided we're going to make it more difficult. So now if you're going to do that, well, you're going to house them in the process. Where's your profit? The city of Toronto created what they created because they were losing so many affordable units to developers, right? Every rule has been created because somebody, one bad apple, decided to ruin it for the bunch. And unfortunately, I find that many of these rules that have been adjusted impact the smaller landlords specifically, because it's the smaller landlords who seem to have these more heightened emotional responses versus very corporate, structured, systematic responses. And it's because the big corporations have the reserves to be able to weather these storms. And the smaller landlord who's just trying to build that nest egg doesn't. So if rent doesn't come in 1 month, 2 months, like their entire livelihood is at risk, versus the big REIT who owns that 500 unit building, 10 tenants aren't paying rent, whatever, let's follow the process and do everything we're supposed to do. And eventually we're going to get them out because we know we will, but at least we showed we did. And if you are able to create that kind of reserve so that you can weather the storm and keep a cool head, you'll find that you're less likely to violate people's rights, because you're able to think as a business owner and find solutions to your problem versus, I'm going to lose my house. My kids are not going to be able to eat. Get the hell out, you horrible, blah, 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 blah. And then something that I said now is a very discriminatory thing. And now I've got a $10,000 fine from the Human Rights Tribunal, and then the landlord and tenant board's not going to evict, and it just snowballs. It's sad, but it's terrible.
Yeah, and you have to be aware of all these laws. I've got one example that I always like to look back on. We had someone who had a rental unit, apartment building, heart of the city of Toronto, like Spadina, St. Clair area.
Oh.
The owner wants to demolish and put up a couple condos, which they're allowed to do. So they were allowed to do that, but the city said anybody that's in a rental unit still under a lease now has the right to go back into that building in an equivalent unit. They had a 2-bedroom unit. So when the condo gets built, they can go back in there and pay the same rent that they were paying. They were paying $800 a month or whatever. So it was supposed to take, 3 years to build it. It took 10 years till they got through. So they lived somewhere else for 10 years and they get a notice. Hey, the building's up. You're entitled to come in and you can choose unit A, B, or C because they're 2-bedroom equivalents. You can move back in at $800 a month. Everybody else in the building is paying $3,000, $4,000 a month at St. Clair and Avenue Road, St. Clair and Spadina. They're allowed to come in and pay $800, and then their rent increases can only go up from there. So they move back in 10 years later after living somewhere else. How do you can't turn it down, right? And they can stay as long as they want, as long as it's them. They can't sublease it to somebody else or assign it to somebody else, but they're grandfathered, right? So you have to know what the rules are.
So sublet, if we have the time, just very quickly, I want to touch on that because this is something I don't think everybody is fully aware of either. The Landlord and Tenant Board has a very clear piece of legislation in the Residential Tenancies Act that says that a tenant is able to sublet their unit, but they're not allowed to make a profit. So I'm in a lease, and so a sublet, number one, means that they have the intention to return. So if I'm moving permanently and my cousin wants to take over my unit, I can't sublet my unit to my cousin permanently knowing I'm not coming back for the same rent because my rent is really low. That's not allowed. But if I'm going overseas, let's say, and I intend to come back at the end of my 2-year, post, I can sublet, but I'm not allowed to make a profit. So there have been cases, thank goodness, that have been adjudicated at the Landlord and Tenant Board where the tenants have been found in violation because they were subletting. So they rent a house. A lot of people do this. They rent a house and then they turn it into an Airbnb. Don't do that. You know what I mean? Like the city of Toronto or the city of Vaughan or all of these municipalities who have these short-term rental licensing requirements say that a tenant is allowed to Airbnb their residence because it's their primary residence. But the Landlord and Tenant Board says, me, the tenant, can't make a profit. So if I pay $3,000 a month in rent, I can run an Airbnb business and rent out my room until I make $3,000 that month. And then after that, any dollars that I've earned is now a violation of landlord-tenant laws. So as a landlord, this is one extra thing that you have now that you're able to ensure that your interests are protected, because people will try and maintain. So let's say I know I'm going to go away to university. I've got a really great unit. It's rent controlled and it's super low below market. I'm going to sublet it. And when I come back, I'm going to go, but I'm going to sublet it for $400 more because market rent is $800 more. And now I've got a little bit of extra money for my new place because my new place costs more. You can get that entire thing terminated immediately if you find that out, as long as you file the proper paperwork. So just keep that in mind. And sublet, there are a lot of people who get very upset that the landlord-tenant board allows sublets. Sublet is only if the tenant intends to return. So there has to be an intention to return. If there is no intention, like I'm moving out of the country, I'm going to sublet my unit. No, you can't. And you are very much within your rights to do that. It gets very mixed up in social media and things like that. There are, you know, news articles sometimes from journalists who don't want to do their full due diligence and understanding. And, you know, they have a right to assign. You have the right to screen an applicant, and that person has to go through the process, and that's allowed. But a sublet means you're coming back. You are still Mr. or Mrs. Tenant, ultimately responsible for that lease. So if your sublet doesn't pay, you're paying me because you are still the one primarily responsible. Just as a, I don't think everybody understands that either. Sorry.
Well, Lena, this has been really eye-opening. And you know, I think your wealth of experience really shines through some of these stories. And you know, it's unfortunate that when it comes to investing, when it comes to property management, when it comes to dealing with tenants, you know, there really isn't a lot of formal education. It's more, you know, hands-on experience that you have to have dealing with the right people, and surrounding yourself with, you know, the right professionals to really guide you and help you through some of these processes. And you know, I'm really excited about cultivating a relationship with you and with New Venture Management through Sutton Summit and through REI, because I think, you know, I think by combining our efforts, you know, we're going to educate more people and you know, create more feel good situations out there, which is what I'm all about. So, you know, thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your experience. We're going to have you back again on future podcasts, and we're going to, you know, get into some more tenant issues. We're going to get into some more great stories, and you know, we're going to get into U.S. investing as well, because you know, there's so many Canadians that want to learn more, including realtors, and want to learn more about U.S. investing, and you have a wealth of knowledge. So we're going to have you back. But thank you so much for joining us and for spending the time and educating us. And you know, great stories, and we're really excited to continue the conversation again in the future.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Thanks.